Hello and welcome to the Physiology of Endurance Running podcast. I'm Owain. I'm joined by Dan. How's it going, Dan?
Yeah, good, thanks. Yeah, uh, off the back of two really good interviews, it's made me very excited to be podcasting. So yeah,
Yeah,
I'm doing well. How are you
yeah,
doing?
yeah. Good. Yeah, I mean, yeah, like you said, busy week of recording some interviews, but yeah, they were both really good. This is the second one. So this you're about to listen to an interview with Dr. Rich Blagrove. Rich is a senior lecturer in physiology at Loughborough University. But more specifically, he's incredibly knowledgeable both as a practitioner and a researcher about strength and conditioning. We did an episode, I want to say like 9 months ago now, a long old time ago about strength and conditioning. And Rich has come on to, I don't think, correct any mistakes. He didn't say
He
we had
said
said
we didn't
anything
make
wrong.
any mistakes last time.
Yeah,
He did listen. He has listened to it, and yeah, but provide more detail. The expert opinion.
yeah.
Uh,
And probably worth saying as well that when we did that first episode, a lot of the information we got was from the book that Rich has written, which, from right, I've not got it here, but it's strength. Is it strength and conditioning for endurance runners?
that's it. Yeah,
So yeah, if you'd like your own physical sort of resource for getting into strength and conditioning, yeah, look up Rich's book. It's really good. It's a really nice blend of sort of the evidence base at the start and then how to actually do it. And I think that's what makes Rich a really interesting person to chat to, is that he's done research, but he's also just worked as a strength and conditioning coach, so sort of knows what the evidence says, but knows what actually happens when you try and do it in person with different levels of athletes as well. And he sort of alludes to the fact that he's worked in team sports and he's worked, with really high level runners as well. So it has a massive range of
yeah.
experience.
And he clearly just loves the sport as well. He's a runner himself. We had to wait for the Oslo Dream Mile to be concluded before we could start recording, just to see what the outcome was there. And yeah, definitely just you can just tell in the interview. I hope that he's just really like passionate for running and helping people get as fast as they can.
Yeah, yeah, definitely, and yeah, helped clear up some myths as well. I think, which was quite nice. Yeah, hopefully some nice sort of practical take home messages as well as some sort of discussion of the research.
Yeah, definitely, really good interview. I really enjoyed this one.
Yeah.
Before we get into that, let's give a shout out to our podcast sponsors, Saw. So yeah, Saw, creators of really nice running apparel. Just doing the washing, hanging out Jemima's vest that I bought her, a Saw vest. 93% recycled material, but also like really high quality as well.
Yeah,
So if yeah, definitely an ethical brand, all made in the EU. I'm pretty sure Portugal, a lot of it's made, and yeah, just really nice stuff. Go check them out. Especially as it's getting a bit warmer, get yourself an actual garment that's going to keep you cool. It's not just become saturated with sweat. If you're anything like me, or if you're anything like I was running up Rebecca and Beacons for Castles Relay, I was a mess at the top. Uh, but yeah, definitely go check that out.
and then I guess one last thing before the interview. A couple of weeks ago, we launched the Endurance Collective. We've had loads of responses for people that are interested in being coached. I think at this point we're probably pretty much full, but there's no reason why, if you're not interested, still like fill out the form on the website, get in touch. It might be sort of as our say our working lives around coaching evolve over the next few weeks and months. We might be taking more people on. It's not a sort of the door is closed, I guess, proposition. So yeah, if you're interested, still fill out the form, get in touch. And yeah, as we sort of detailed on the podcast with Jen a few weeks ago, yeah, we're taking a really sort of evidence led approach to coaching, in the same way we do with this podcast, where you know if we don't know a topic already, we're spending time sort of reading the literature and hopefully, yeah, being led by evidence and taking a long term performance planning approach. Um, yeah, but yeah, the website will be in the show notes and on our socials. So yeah, have a look if you're interested and haven't yet had a look. But yeah, I think that's it from us.
Yeah, enjoy this interview. We both did. I think it's a really, really good one. Hopefully, something to definitely go. I'm going to go back and listen to it again.
Yeah,
Definitely to help me inform my own S&C prep in the run up to Valencia.
yeah, cool. Catch everyone soon. So we're joined today by Rich Blagrove. Rich is an associate professor at Loughborough University. He specializes in S&C is probably the right way to put it. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, my job title is a senior lecturer in physiology, so it's often a bit confusing. I never know whether I'm a physiologist masquerading as an S&C coach or an S&C coach masquerading as a physiologist, but I do a bit of both.
Yeah, that's probably a good place to be, right? Because I think you can be quite separate, and yeah, maybe
Yeah,
get a bit too siloed, right? And actually having that crossover knowledge is probably really useful.
yeah, absolutely. And as you guys know, my main passion and interest over the last couple of decades has been middle and long distance running. And so if you're an S&C specialist working with runners, you can't get away from understanding the physiology of middle and long distance running. So yeah, it's been important that I've tried to publish work and be a bit of an exercise physiologist. But yeah, I guess as a practitioner, I come from a strength and conditioning coaching background.
Yeah, yeah, and that was maybe something I briefly wanted to touch on, just doing a bit of research for this episode, and I thought it was quite interesting, at least as far as I could tell. You I guess stepped out of, or went away from that sort of constant progression a lot of people make of undergrad, masters, PhD, and you went into the applied world for a bit, and then came back into did a PhD
Yeah.
and are now lecturing. Do you think that helps? Would you maybe recommend that path for people of doing some? I don't want to say completely stepping away from academia, but yeah, doing some more applied work.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and let's go deep to start off with. career philosophy. Yeah, I mean, when after I finished my masters, and yeah, I was kind of like hunting around for jobs. Like the strength and conditioning coaching field was in its infancy, and so I started doing a little bit of coaching with a football and a basketball team, and really enjoyed it. Got my professional accreditation and so on. And then all of these degrees and master's programs started popping up at different universities around the UK. And because I'd done a little bit of teaching and a little bit of strength and conditioning coaching, I decided to apply for a role as a lecturer in strength and conditioning down at St Mary's University in London. And yeah, secured the job. But yeah, I think a lot of your listeners will know about St Mary's, that they've got this fantastic running tradition and this great community of runners in and around the university. But it's very much a more sort of teaching and learning centred university. So I was doing a fair bit of teaching, but alongside that, I started to work with a lot of the runners that were based at St Mary's. And yeah, I did that through until about 2015. And I thought, if I'm going to progress in academia, I probably need to get a little bit more involved with research. So I've done bits and pieces, but a kind of natural avenue of research for me was looking at the role of strength and conditioning activities with runners. And so I sort of naturally progressed into that line of work.
So I guess if we start talking about some of the research, and I think we sort of divided it up into, I guess, big areas, and maybe if
Yeah,
we start with running economy, and
yeah,
it's something we talk about a lot on this podcast as one of the sort of key determinants of performance, and I think this is maybe where maybe more so for the long distance runners, if we separate middle and long distance runners, this is maybe where S&C can have a real impact on running economy. And yeah, we just sort of wanted to dive into that, I guess.
yeah.
I guess that's sort of been one of the areas of your research, right? Is looking at the impact then on running economy.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, I know you've spoken about these three main determinants or pillars of endurance performance quite a lot on the podcast. So I won't repeat all the fantastic episodes that you've had before, but as means of a very quick recap, like we've got three main physiological determinants of middle and long distance running performance, and that's VO2 max, or maximal oxygen uptake, which is the highest rate at which we can get oxygen from the atmosphere into the body, transport it to the working muscles, and then use that oxygen to support oxidative metabolism. Secondly, we've got something known as fractional utilization, which tends to be used synonymously with lactic threshold and other metabolic thresholds, and that kind of represents the percentage or the proportion of VO2 max that can be accessed for a given distance or duration. And so that's really, really important for marathon running performance, as you mentioned. And then the third thing is running economy. And so running economy is defined as the oxygen or the energy cost that a runner can use at a submaximal intensity. And obviously the lower that is, the better, like the less oxygen or energy that you can use to sustain 14 or 16 kilometers an hour, the more kind of efficient the muscles are at using oxygen and energy. But yeah, I guess the really interesting bit, just to sort of start answering your question now, is the VO2 max and fractional utilization or lactic threshold. Like those things are mainly developed by just doing different types of running. So obviously high volumes of moderate intensity work, and extensive interval training and tempo type efforts. Whereas running economy seems to be influenced by like a broader range of different systems and factors within the body. So we know that putting on a pair of super shoes is going to enhance your economy a little bit. So we know that kind of technology helps. We know that a runner's biomechanics and the way they're kind of expressing force against the ground is really important. And then for me as a strength and conditioning coach, what we know quite well is that different neuromuscular factors are also heavily related to economy. And so things like the types of muscle fibers that we're using when the foot's on the ground, how much fibers are elongating and then contracting while the foot's on the ground, how much we're relying on particularly the Achilles tendon to store and return elastic energy. And so all of these sort of neuromuscular characteristics can obviously be improved by doing strength training. And so we've got some quite good evidence that if we do a period of strength training for several months, that it improves running economy and that results in improvements in performance.
I guess that lends on to what sort of types of strength training or plyometric training are most suited to shift that running economy. What's the evidence base there?
Yeah, and I mean, the studies have used lots and lots of different types of activities and exercises, which can often get quite confusing. But in the review that we published, we essentially put this kind of wide bracket of strength and conditioning into three main training activities. So we've got heavy resistance training, which is, I guess, the traditional type of strength training that runners would associate with getting stronger. And so going to the gym and trying to lift sort of moderate to heavy loads through fairly low repetition ranges. Secondly, we've got using quite light loads, but trying to accelerate them as quickly as possible. And so we'd often term that power training or kind of ballistic type training, where essentially we're just trying to apply force as quickly as we possibly can. And then thirdly, we've got plyometric training, which is things like jumping, hopping, bounding type activities, which are mainly used to try and develop the stretch shortening cycle. So the ability to use elastic energy, particularly from the Achilles tendon, as part of a kind of running technique or while the foot's on the ground. And so, I mean, the evidence around those three different sort of broad types of strength and conditioning is kind of fairly equal. Like if you look across the literature, there's some studies that show that heavy resistance training works well. There's a few that show that explosive and ballistic training works really nicely. And equally, there's a handful of studies that show plyometric training is quite effective as well. And then there's also studies that combine all of them. And so they put all of them into the same session or the same training program over a few months. And those seem to be the most effective. And so I guess my kind of recommendation around this is it's important to be using all those different types of training activity, and you can either put them all into the same type of session and just do a small amount of each, or you can kind of periodize it over a longer period of time and say, okay, let's do a couple of months of heavy resistance training, let's then do a couple of months of more explosive or ballistic training, and then let's do a couple of months of more plyometric type work. So I think all of those different scenarios work, and I think if runners are working with a coach, they'll usually find a kind of strategy and a recipe which is best for them.
And I guess,
do you think that going back to the periodization versus throwing it all in together and making a concoction in a single session, what would your preference be there? Do you as a practitioner, when you're starting working with an athlete, what would be your starting point, I guess?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked me that follow-up question, Dan, because it's quite important. I think with young runners and runners that haven't really engaged very much with strength training before, like my approach is generally to use what I would term like a concurrent type model. And so I'd have all of those different types of activities within the same session. The reason being, like as fairly logically as you would know, you don't need a very big dosage of any of those in order to drive an adaptation. And so most of the research shows that you only need something like 6 or 7 sets of lower body heavy resistance training to drive a positive response. And so you could probably just pick 2 or 3 exercises and get through them in probably about 20 minutes or so. And so if you're at a gym environment, you're kind of like, well, I've got a little bit more time to play with here. Why don't I put a little bit of plyometrics in as part of a warm-up? Why don't I also do some box jumps or throw some medicine balls or do some weighted jumping and do some more explosive power type work? And the session can still take about 45 minutes. Like you can be in and out of a gym environment pretty quickly, but you've done a small amount of plyos, you've done a small amount of explosive work, you've done a small amount of heavy resistance training. And so you've kind of got benefits from all of those areas. I think as runners become more experienced and particularly stronger, you obviously need a slightly higher volume in each of those 3 different areas. And so that's when, if runners can only still dedicate 45 minutes to an hour within a strength and conditioning session, like you probably need to dedicate more time to one of those activities. And so with some of the elite runners that I work with, they will go to the gym and maybe do 12 or so sets of just lower limb resistance training. And there's not really any plyometrics or explosive work. And they'll move on to those activities later on in the year, perhaps closer to competitions.
Yeah, I mean, that logically makes sense, doesn't it? Like you can think of it in terms of just running volume. Like if you're new to running, you don't need to do much running to get much better at it. So you don't. Why go and run 100 miles a week when you can get a lot of benefit from doing 30 miles a week,
Exactly,
regardless of the injury risk, etc. Do you?
Precisely.
Yeah.
So
what about
Yeah,
exactly. What about like the order within the session? Like you said there, you would, if you were gonna do a mixture of everything, would you go plyos first when you're probably least fatigued, I guess, to be in its most explosive, and then go into more heavy resistance stuff? Or do you think that doesn't matter too much?
Yeah, it definitely does matter for a couple of reasons. Firstly, when any sort of athlete first arrives at a session, they're obviously like unfatigued or less fatigued, and probably a little bit more kind of mentally engaged with the activity that they're about to do. And so it certainly makes sense to do any sorts of activities that require a little bit more skill, they're perhaps a little bit more complex in nature, and they just require a bit more concentration. So particularly if you're jumping on and off boxes, or you're having to jump over hurdles, or I don't know, doing some sort of bounding, like it definitely makes sense to do those sorts of activities earlier in the session. Plus, because those activities like do fatigue the neuromuscular system quite a lot, it's generally not going to be as effective to have them towards the end of the session. So there's a potential for injury risk there, and they're just not going to be performed as well if the athlete's carrying a little bit of fatigue. Whereas the heavier resistance type work, you can generally get away with feeling a little bit tireder, being not quite concentrating as much, and just kind of move in and out of the ranges with a moderate to heavy load, and still be fine. So I tend to put those sessions more towards the middle part of the session. And then I guess an area that we've not really spoken about at all yet is that I'd always have some exercises towards the back end of the session, which are designed to overload structures which are potentially quite vulnerable to injury. So usually with most of the runners that I work with is trying to target tendons, muscles, joints where they've had injuries in the past. And so taking me as an example, that would always be the calf and the Achilles. With other athletes, it might be a bit more focused around the trunk because they've had a history of lower back pain, or they've got a niggling high hamstring tendinopathy or something. And so there's a little cluster of exercises which is designed to sort of just overload the hamstring in that scenario. And again, you can carry a little bit of fatigue into those sorts of exercises and not worry about getting through them. Whereas, yeah, as I say, with the plyos, I'd definitely have those earlier.
And with that stuff, like structure, so give that example of the Achilles tendon. Then are you going eccentric, or are you going isometric, or is it just a full range of motion, concentric, contraction?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, though. And I think in terms of injury prevention, the jury's still out a bit. I mean, what we definitely know about tendons is that they respond really, really well to heavy loads. Like whether that load's then applied in a kind of eccentric manner, so the muscle's kind of lengthening under tension with the tendon, or whether it's applied statically with an isometric load, I don't think matters too much, is essentially what the research is indicating. Like I do quite like performing isometrics with the calf complex, because if we take the calf through a really long range of movement, you get quite a lot of compression through the Achilles, which can sometimes aggravate niggling Achilles tendons. And there's always a slight risk that you might kind of shift the force length relationship of the gastrocnemius and the soleus, which are the two main muscles around the calf, which might be disadvantageous to running economy. Whereas if we're kind of strengthening it in quite an isometric position, particularly a position which is relevant to what the ankle's in during ground contact, that's probably going to be a little bit more effective rather than just moving in and out of full range of movement.
And I think in that answer you sort of touched on maybe one of the other topics we wanted to touch on, which is injury prevention and the use of S&C for that. I think I don't know if we call it like an urban myth, maybe, that people think like, I'll just get in the gym and I won't get injured.
Yeah.
I guess, like, just on the face of it, do you think that's true? And is there much evidence sort of bearing in mind how difficult it would even be to conduct that sort of research on injury prevention anyway? But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, you are exactly right, Owen, that there are some runners out there that seem to believe that S&C sort of provides this kind of magic bullet, and if they do a really effective program, then they're never going to get injured again. But we know injury is quite complex, and there's a lot of different factors that feed into the reason why a runner might get injured. And strength might be one of those. And if runners are particularly weak around a particular joint, and because if either they're running biomechanics or they're running footwear or the surface that they're running on, like that particular joint or structure is particularly exposed to repetitive high forces, the risk of them getting injured might increase. So the kind of theoretical rationale is, well, if we strengthen that tissue and we make it a bit more robust and resilient, then potentially the runner can cope with higher workloads. And then the kind of direct evidence for that isn't particularly strong, but you kind of alluded to it, that the studies are very, very difficult to do, because essentially what you need is a really large cohort of runners. And as odd as it sounds, you kind of want them to get injured because you want some of them to be doing strength and conditioning programs, some of them not to be, and then you want to compare the injury rates between the two groups. And so there are studies that have attempted to do that, and we published a review that summarised 12 of those studies. And the consensus across those 12 studies that had about, I think, 2,000 runners was that strength and conditioning activities don't seem to reduce injury risk or injury rates. But what we did notice is that the studies that do find a positive effect, in other words, strength and conditioning does help reduce risk of getting injured, they tended to be the studies that had used an element of supervision. And so it kind of sounds quite obvious that if you set a strength and conditioning program that a practitioner believes is going to reduce your risk of injury, if you don't do it, then obviously it's not going to lower your risk of injury. Whereas these studies actually checks that athletes were doing it. There was an element of coaching, so the exercises were being executed properly. And they ended up getting positive outcomes compared to a group of runners that weren't doing any strength and conditioning. And so it's quite, at the moment, it's quite weak evidence because the sample sizes are quite small. But there's a suggestion there that as long as runners are engaging with it for a long period of time, it might help reduce risk of injury.
It's probably quite injury specific as well, isn't it? Like you said, the Achilles responds really well to being loaded, whereas whatever strength training you do, it's probably not going to protect you against a bone stress injury if you're underfueled. Would you say?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. And yeah, again, I'm glad you asked me that follow-up question, because obviously the way that scientific studies will tend to approach this is they'll just write a program that they believe is going to work for most runners, but it's definitely not individualized, like you say. Whereas the approach that a strength and conditioning coach would use, and the way that I've worked with all of my runners over the years, including those that I'm still working with, is you look at their injury history, because we know that that's the main risk factor for any future injury. We look at their running biomechanics to some extent. We look at their strength profile and their kind of broader movement profile, and then we try to pinpoint the areas that they're probably going to be most vulnerable. And so, as we said before, if runners have had a lot of Achilles issues, or a lot of knee issues, or hamstring issues, you kind of need to bias that part of their S&C program towards the areas that they're likely to pick up injuries again. And the way that I tend to program, particularly with more well-trained and elite runners, is if they've got a cross-country season, for example, and they've just come off the back of a track season, like a cross-country terrain, both for training and racing, is going to pose quite a different stress compared to doing training sessions and running on the track. And so we'll tend to shift the types of exercises we're doing to help them protect against getting injuries on that type of terrain. And similarly, if they go off to, I don't know, a training camp in Font Romeu or in East Africa somewhere, or over in America, I'll always be quite interested in knowing, well, what sort of terrain you're going to be running on there. Like, is it quite sort of rutted and uneven underfoot? Is it quite flat, or are you going to be running over lots of hills? And so that will tend to kind of, again, bias the types of exercises and areas that I'm trying to target. And so the S&C is always kind of like one step ahead of what's going to happen with the running training.
What sort of exercises are you doing to try protect against those injuries? Like what changes?
So for example, if they go into an environment that's going to be quite uneven underfoot, like we'll tend to start doing a little bit more barefoot. Particularly in multi-directions. We'll start adding in maybe a little bit of proprioceptive type work and a small amount on unstable surfaces. And then that will progress towards doing some low intensity plyometrics without shoes on, and also on and off unstable surfaces plyometrically as well. And so, yeah, it doesn't become the whole program. It's not like they're doing that for 2 or 3 hours a week. It's just sort of 10 or 15 minutes added in, usually towards the start of the session. And then they do their normal heavy resistance training and ballistic work and a little bit of other plyometric work as well.
Just I guess if I can ask you to put maybe more of your practitioner hat on here.
Yeah.
And I think, again, I feel like we're dealing with maybe some sort of urban myths of runners, but you see runners going out and running up hills to get strong. And I think maybe they're in a bit of a specificity trap, which is something you mentioned actually in your book, I think, in terms of just exercise selection. But how do you balance not going too far down a specificity trap in terms of this exercise is really beneficial directly to running versus something that's just more globally beneficial? I'm just interested in your exercise choice, and then even on a sort of macro level with the program as well.
Yeah, it's a really important question, that one. And yeah, I think people that believe that running up hills is strength training probably need to start just by revisiting just basic definitions of what we mean by strength. And what we're really referring to there is it's the highest amount of force that a muscle or a muscle group can develop. And so in order to develop strength, in order to change neuromuscular characteristics in the muscle, you obviously need to be quite specific to that definition and not get too far away from like maximal levels of force production, which is going back to what I mentioned before, why we tend to use fairly heavy loads and repetition ranges of sort of 8 repetitions or less, ideally, once we've got athletes skilled on an exercise. And so if you contrast that to running up a hill, and we're all runners, so we sort of know how that feels. Like you're taking about 3 steps or 3 repetitions per second when you're running up a hill. So after about sort of 5 or 6 seconds, just based on sort of our understanding of energy systems, you will quickly start shifting to something that represents sort of more of a metabolic workout. And so things like blood lactate will rise, other metabolites in the muscle will rise, and those become therefore the sort of the main limiting factors of completing that set of work. Does that sort of make sense? And so we're definitely not saying that's not important. Like every runner, or most runners, should be running up hills and using it as a sort of cardiometabolic type workout. And I think particularly middle distance runners will be doing those types of sessions most of the week. But it's not enough of a stimulus to overload muscular strength, just because of the number of reps and the type of stress that we're putting through the muscle. And so therefore you need to place athletes in an environment where they can safely produce high levels of force relative to them. And so that environment has to be a kind of weights room type environment where they can add some external load safely, move in and out of range safely, just in case they need to drop the weight, or they can pick it up and put it back safely, and so on. And that provides the muscle and the neuromuscular system with the appropriate type of stress to cause adaptation in the muscles and in that system. And so they're both really, really important, but to me, they're very, very different. And we can kind of see that through the evidence as well, that there's no studies that I know of that show that performing hill sprints is going to change maximal strength. And equally, there's no evidence that performing strength training with the way that I've described it is going to change your sort of cardiometabolic type characteristics. Like you need to be running to do that.
So to get into a bit more detail about prescription, because I know that people love the details, don't they? And
yeah,
I know
sure.
but as you said, you'll profile an athlete and you will see what they need based upon their individual profile. Having said that, are there any key exercises that you would pretty much have every athlete do, or at least some movement patterns that you're looking to try and produce in an S&C program?
Yeah, you've kind of added that nice caveat in there at the start there, Dan. That there's, I think people always kind of want, what's the best program that I should be doing? And it's always really difficult to answer these types of questions because, exactly as you said, it sort of depends on the athlete's experience and injury history and the facilities and the equipment they've got access to. Like a whole host of different things is going to produce that sort of optimal program for them. But I think, I think kind of based on what most studies have found, like initially runners, as long as runners are engaging with some form of strength training activities consistently, so by that I mean a couple of times a week for a period of at least several months, they're generally going to get a bit of a jump in their running economy and in their strength. Like what that is, and this doesn't sound very scientific, but it probably doesn't really matter too much. And there's this, I don't know if you ever heard of this, a principle called the Pareto principle, which basically, we use it quite a lot in S&C actually, but it essentially means that you get about 80% of the benefit for the first 20% of work that you put in. And I think that can be applied to this question in this scenario, in that if a runner goes to a gym and they go, I'm going to go on the leg press, or I'm going to go on the leg extension or the leg curl machine. And then I'm going to go and do some squats. And okay, I'll go and jump on this box. And now I'm feeling a bit tired. I've probably done 4 exercises there. I'll leave the gym. Like that's probably going to be enough to get about 80% of the benefit that they need, at least for the initial phase of training. Like the other 20% is going to come through that individualization and some more effective coaching and prescription of the exercises. And so I'm not saying that that's not helpful, but I think in the early days, it's just important that runners are just doing something, because the difference between these exercises and activities is kind of negligible in terms of the benefit. But yeah, if they have got a coach, and if I was working with a runner, like I generally prescribe the lower body resistance training exercises in 4 main categories. And so that's some sort of squatting based movement, some sort of hip hinging based movement, which loads the glutes and the hamstrings a little bit more. Some sort of lunging pattern, so starting off with like a split squat or a reverse lunge, and then some sort of stepping pattern, so like a kind of low box step up or some sort of dead leg step up type movement. And I think if you spread those across a couple of sessions and you were to do 3 or 4 sets of each of the exercises with a load that's sort of moderate for you, then you're not going to go too far wrong. And I think those are sort of 4 kind of fundamental movement skills that runners ought to be mastering anyway. I think then you layer on a little bit of low intensity plyometrics, definitely some loading for the calf complex. You've got a fairly well-rounded S&C program.
Yeah, nice. I guess the just thing to add on to that is, I think the summary is everything will work, but also making sure you're not doing 30 reps or 40 reps and trying to recreate basically a hill sprint situation that you set up earlier, like making it more metabolic and not a strength overload.
Yeah, exactly. And usually when I first start coaching runners, we might drift up to about 12 repetitions per set. But the rationale for that is usually if they want to learn how to squat or learn how to do a deadlift or learn how to do a split squat or whatever, they just need like basic principles of skill acquisition. They just need some extra repetitions just to kind of practice the movement a few times. And so something around 12, they might start to get a little bit tired and the muscles start to burn. And as you say, it starts to become a bit more metabolic than kind of strength, and would usually stop then, have 2 or 3 minutes rest, and then perform the exercise again. But very, very rarely would we drift much above that. And it becomes like another endurance training session.
To follow on from that then, how do you fit, or how do you think it fits best into a week's training, and how do you make sure that you're not taking away from a running, but also ensuring you can still have high quality gym sessions too? So I guess that's what's a challenge.
No, it's an excellent question, that. And again, it sounds like a bit of a cop-out answer, but I'd still go back to this sort of like Pareto principle that I explained before, that because every runner is quite different, you've got runners at the elite level who running is their life, and they can be resting for sort of 10, 12 hours a day without doing anything else, all the way through to more recreational runners that have got a partner, 2 or 3 kids, like a full-time job. They've got to commute to work. They've got to do all the shopping and all the chores and all these sorts of things. And they're squeezing not only their running, but their S&C into this really, really busy lifestyle. Like I would generally say for those that are just starting out, like just fitting it in somewhere is better than doing nothing. And okay, it's not optimal, like it's not perfect, but if the only time they've got to do it is in the evening, maybe after they've done a run, with some basic equipment in a home-based environment, I would still say that that's better than doing nothing at all. For the runner that's a bit more experienced and has perhaps got a bit more flexibility and wants to get a bit more granular and scientific about the way that they're prescribing their S&C, there's probably 2 main approaches. The traditional one that most studies use is placing a strength and conditioning session on an easier day. And so if you've got like a fairly easy, moderate intensity recovery type run of, I guess for a well-trained run, it might be up to about an hour-ish. Like do that run maybe in the morning, have about 6 to 8 hours recovery, and then try and do your S&C later in the day if you can. And then try to place the harder sessions at least 24 hours away from that, just to try to maximize the recovery as much as possible. A completely different approach, which I think it actually kind of emerged from British athletics and some of the kind of internal research that they were doing, is to place the hard S&C sessions on the same day as hard running sessions. And so let's say as an example, on a Tuesday morning, a runner might go to the track or do a road session of 6 by K off a minute for like a 5 to 10K run. So it's a pretty grueling, hard key session of the week, where they might be covering like 8 to 10 miles of work. Have 2 or 3 hours recovery, and then go and do your S&C after that. And the kind of theory behind that, or the thinking behind it, is that you put all your kind of hard physical work on the same day. And so the following sort of 48 hours after that is sort of like true recovery. It's some sort of moderate intensity, easy type running or cross training. And there's nothing getting in the way of just making sure that you're recovering from that hard kind of physical work. I've used that sort of approach with a handful of runners, and some of them seem to prefer it. And it does tend to be the more well-trained ones that can recover really, really quickly. The other just quick word of caution, if you were to try that approach, is that with any sort of heavy resistance training, you tend to be able to get away with it, because you can just kind of like grind through the repetitions. There's no real kind of time constraint or needs to express force really, really quickly. Like, you just kind of get through the reps and get through the exercises. However, if you were to try to do either plyometric training or any sort of explosive ballistic type work where you've got to move really, really fast, and as we were saying before, it requires a little bit more focus and attention and effort, it's a little bit more difficult to do that if you've just put 6 by K off a minute in your legs and you've had 2 hours of recovery, and then you've got to be doing bounding or jumping over hurdles. Like, there's a big red flag there for me, just around injury and just execution of the exercises generally. And so I think it works okay with heavier resistance training, but probably less so with anything that's a bit more explosive.
I think just on your sort of word of caution there, and this is showing my like relative lack of knowledge of S&C, but as far as I understand, there is, or at least something that's used in research, and something I've overheard, like from actually Neve, who's been mentioned on here before, helping Dan with his S&C, is like lifting with intent and like bar tracking. And like tracking, if you're doing a squat, tracking the speed of the bar that you're lifting. Would using a tracking app be something to sort of think about doing? So if you can see that you're significantly slower than normal, then maybe you think, actually, I'm grinding this out, just pull the plug. Is that maybe one way of not making that mistake you just sort of talked about?
Yeah, absolutely. So what you're describing there is essentially velocity-based training, which has become really, really popular in S&C. So yeah, there's quite fancy, expensive devices that you will find in a lot of S&C facilities. And equally, I think, as you sort of alluded to, there's apps that are fairly cheap that you can use to sort of track the end of a barbell, and then it just basically gives you a speed on the way up. If you can figure out... I'm trying to think of a quick way to explain this. If you can figure out your kind of zones, and it's not too dissimilar to sort of running zones, like moderate, heavy, severe intensity domain, like you can kind of do the same based upon the speed at which a bar is moving on an exercise. And it corresponds quite nicely then to whether it's a little bit more maximal strength, a bit more sort of strength speedy, or whether it's sort of like a pure power and speed repetition. And you can then use those zones to track, okay, I'm feeling quite tired today, so I've drifted outside of where I'm supposed to be compared to previous weeks. And so therefore you either take a little bit of weight off the bar or you scrap the session because you're probably just a little bit too tired. So it's a way that a lot of strength and conditioning coaches will monitor within sessions, and then from session to session to track progress and improvement without having to test one repetition max or vertical jump height all the time.
I guess where it goes back to your principle you mentioned earlier, that the name's gone from my head, but just doing something is going to be better than doing nothing, isn't it? And so actually, if the vast majority of people, I think me included, and definitely I'm going to say for you as well, Owain, but you included, but the most important thing would be doing some S&C and not getting injured from it as well, obviously.
Yeah,
but
absolutely. And I think it's the same. It's the same as your running training. Like if you arrive at an S&C session and based on your training program, like you're fully expecting to be tired because you're in a heavy block, like for you, Dan, you're probably running upwards of 100 miles a week, And it's like I know day to day and session to session, I'm expecting to feel tired. And so, but I'm going to get through the sessions because I've either got a recovery week next week, or in 2 weeks' time, I'm going to taper for a race. And so it's kind of almost like a pre-planned fatigue. And it's the same with S&C, that there's nothing wrong with kind of going to a session, going through the motions. Okay, it wasn't the best quality in the world, but I got the session done and it still served a purpose, and it's still sort of nudging adaptation forward. Whereas, if you're going into a track season and you're trying to bounce from session to session and you want them to be really high quality because you're not far off race pace and you've got some big events coming up in the next few weeks, you're fully expecting S&C sessions to be high quality as well. And so it's just about making sure that you've got a sound program in place, and you kind of know what to expect in terms of your state of fatigue and readiness to perform.
I think we wanted to talk about a bit of research that's recently come out that you were involved in, looking at durability, and the impact that S&C can have on durability. And I think I was interested in sort of going down two avenues with this. First of all, the measurement that you decided to actually use to measure durability, because it's not there isn't, I guess, a gold standard measurement at the moment, right? And I think there was actually a separate paper that talked about measuring durability, but then also, I guess, to talk about the impact of S&C on durability as well.
Sure.
Two big questions there.
No, absolutely. And so firstly, kind of looping back to what we were talking about initially, and these kind of three main pillars or physiological determinants of performance. Like we obviously measure them in a laboratory-based setting in like a relatively unfatigued state. And so we can produce like a physiological profile for a runner, which sort of describes what they're going to be like on the start line, if you like. But what's emerged quite recently from the literature, and again, I know you've discussed this on your podcast, is that these three physiological determinants aren't static. They're quite dynamic, and they're prone to deteriorate or change during any sort of prolonged fatiguing exercise. And so the extent to which they change or deteriorate is this kind of physiological resilience or durability, as it's been termed. I think the interesting thing about it, and the reason it's kind of being labelled this fourth determinant of performance, is because there is a really high inter-individual variability. And so based on some of Andy Jones's work from Exeter, like he's published some data suggesting that people like Eliud Kipchoge and some of the other athletes that he's worked with, their physiology doesn't seem to change compared to at the start of like a 2-hour marathon run, which sounds ridiculous, but it essentially means they're not really fatiguing, at least in terms of their physiology, during quite a high intensity, prolonged effort. Whereas other runners that have got quite similar physiology on the start line might change by up to 30% in some of the determinants. And so it's probably that's explaining performance differences and race outcomes rather than VO2 max or lactic threshold or running economy. So I think that hopefully kind of answers the question around just what it is and how we measured it. I mean, in the work that I've been involved with Michele Zanini, who was my PhD student and led a lot of great work in this area. The main physiological determinant that we were looking at was running economy and how that was changing over the course of usually 90-minute runs. And so we were quantifying that as a percentage change in running economy over that 90-minute effort, relative to the baseline value or the kind of unfatigued value at the start.
And how did strength training influence that drop off?
Yeah. So I guess this is then the important question. So I guess now we're sort of, as physiologists, getting a bit more understanding of what durability is and how important it is as a determinant. Like the key question that any coaches or runners have got is, well, how do we improve it? How do we change it? I guess first I've got to mention that like the main thing that will improve physiological durability is just doing more running. So like training volume over years seems to be really, really important. Like the long run of the week, I guess traditionally Sunday for most runners, particularly if the long run's got periods at around about race pace, so the intensity that you're targeting within your marathon, that seems to be really important as well. So I think most runners will do a long run, but obviously if you're preparing for a marathon, there's a high level of specificity there that you've got to build up close to the sort of duration that you're expecting to run for a marathon, and try to put some running periods in there that were around the intensity that you're hoping to operate at. But yeah, sorry, to get to your question, Dan, we know one big component of durability in terms of just the mechanisms relates to deterioration in the neuromuscular system. And so, again, related to what we were saying at the start, if we know that strength training can improve some of these neuromuscular characteristics, we had a question around, well, will they sort of deteriorate a little bit less? So therefore offsets this drop that we see in running economy. And so we published a study quite recently that was in 28 male well-trained marathon runners. I think they had an average time of, I think it was about 2 hours 50. So it wasn't too shabby, a bit slower than your time, Dan, but they were reasonably well trained. VO2 max was in the high 50s. They'd all run 10K between about 35 and 40 minutes. And so they were decent, but we split them into two groups, and one group did a couple of strength and plyometric training sessions a week. The other group just carried on their normal running. Both groups recorded their running and were fairly well equated in terms of the volumes and intensities that they were doing. And then we measured their durability during this 90-minute run at a speed that approximated their marathon intensity. And we essentially found that the durability was pretty similar at baseline before the intervention, but after the intervention, the running economy durability had improved to like a fairly sizable extent in the group that had done the strength training compared to the group that had done the running, where it hadn't really changed at all. And so we kind of concluded from that, or we were the first group to show that strength training might also have a role to play in improving durability of running economy.
Yeah, it's really cool, and I think it's interesting, like just on a personal level, sort of seeing this, this new determinant, and then I guess the ways people are like attempting to measure it and to influence it as well. I guess because for all of us, the sort of the three existing determinants have been there our sort of whole, I guess, like academic and careers. But it's really cool. I guess just out of curiosity, has there been anyone sort of come back to you and say, well, I think it might be this, or like I'm not sure about that measurement that you used, because I think some people love an argument, right? And what's the reception been, I guess?
Pretty positive, actually. We haven't had any of that in terms of just the way we've defined durability or measured it. I mean, one of the things that we did in that study that I didn't mention before is we got the runners to run for 90 minutes at a speed that was around about their marathon intensity. So that's pretty hard, particularly if it's on a treadmill and you've not tapered, like you guys can relate. You've not tapered or anything. And then, as cruel as it sounds, like without stopping, we essentially ramped the treadmill speed up to a speed that wasn't far off their VO2 max intensity. And they basically then just ran to exhaustion. And so I think maybe what you're getting at a little bit is that's the way that some people have interpreted durability. It's this, okay, do a prolonged fatiguing effort and then put in a sustained high intensity effort right at the end that almost simulates like a hard finish to a race. And probably the best example is in cycling, where you'll see it in a few weeks' time in the Tour de France, that they're on the bike for sort of 5 or 6 hours. There's a 20 to 30 minute mountain climb at the end, and there's a mountaintop finish. And so the durability in that context isn't, well, how much has your cycling efficiency dropped? It's like, how much have you got left in the tank after 5 or 6 hours of cycling, where you can put in this really high intensity sustained effort for 20 or 30 minutes to try to get to the top of the mountain first. And so, they're two slightly different ways of thinking about it, but they're very, very related because they both relate to the extent to which your physiology's changed compared to the resting state.
Yeah, and I think I was going to mention the cycling example. I've just heard it anecdotally. Riders mentioning sort of in the off season doing like they talk about doing a certain amount of joules of work,
Yeah,
and then an effort, and that's been a thing in as far as I've heard in cycling for decades.
mm-hmm.
So it's all yeah. I guess you could spend years figuring out the best way to measure durability, but it's sort of being inferred and has been inferred, for decades prior. So maybe
Yeah,
just use that. Like it's clearly working. So
absolutely, yeah. And yeah, you sound like some of the other physiologists that I speak to that are like, this durability or physiological resilience construct has suddenly become fashionable again. Yeah, we've kind of known about it for the last 30 years. I mean, there's certainly studies that have measured some of the similar things to us back in the sort of early 90s for sure. So it's always been spoken about and talked about. But I think like most things in sports science, things come around in circles. And so like I think it's really, really positive that it's being highlighted again. Like the work of Michele sort of moved our understanding onto the next level in terms of running. There'll be similar work that's been done in cycling. And then maybe in 5 years' time, like our understanding's improved in terms of what it is, how to measure it, how to improve it, and then people will move on to something else again. So it's definitely not a bad thing that the spotlight's being shone on this area of endurance physiology for sure. And it's we've got better equipment now. We've got better sort of scientific methodologies and ways of measuring things. And so I think revisiting sort of classic or old concepts there's absolutely no harm in that at all.
and I think also just to add as well, like that even just having the I think it's last year the paper was published just measuring measuring durability, and like 6 months prior to that, me and Dan were participants and were helping out in a study looking at durability with almost the same protocol. But like the protocol, I'm sure Dan can explain the story more. But like the protocol got changed because Dan just happened to get a message from someone saying,
It was from Michele.
"Oh, was it from
Okay.
Kelly?"
Yeah.
I didn't realise this.
Yeah. I mean, we were going to go for 50% of a difference between lactate threshold and lactate turn point for 90 minutes. And I think I put something on Twitter about just speculate, like people interested in getting involved. And he messaged me saying, yeah, that's going to be too hard. That's what we wanted to do or something along those lines. And we found like 5 or 10% of a difference, so just above that first lactate threshold. So that was helpful. Otherwise we would have, we were both participants and we wouldn't have got through it. I don't know. It was hard.
Yeah, and it's actually the better trained people that struggle most. So you guys are probably in that category.
But that's funny because that's what we found exactly the same. Some people who were not that well trained could tolerate that very easily.
Yeah.
But I guess it's because it's a much lower percentage of their VO2 max. And
yeah, exactly. And you guys have covered this at that kind of middle band, like the heavy intensity domain for well trained runners is so small and tight that if you get the measurements slightly out because of your kind of measurement error, like you end up really, really close to your sort of maximal metabolic steady state. And therefore, you run at that for maybe 45 minutes, you'd sort of nudge over it. And then there's no turning back from there. Like you're going to be exhausted pretty quickly. But I mean, I think the other thing just to add in really quickly with that example that you just shared of, kind of Michele sharing his protocol and sort of advising on what we found and so on, is that, again, as you know, like most studies in sports science have got very, very small sample sizes compared to other areas of just the natural sciences and sort of broader medicine and so on. Like it's a real problem with the sport and exercise science literature. And so if there are similar studies going on around the UK and around the world that have got similar protocols, it's not necessarily a bad thing because you're firstly kind of replicating the findings of others. But ultimately in maybe 5 years' time, there'll be a meta-analysis that gathers together all of this data. And statistically, it suddenly becomes much, much more well-powered because you've got all these clusters of like 15 participants there and 20 there and 12 over here. And you suddenly group them together and you've got 200. and then you can draw some really meaningful conclusions about a topic within physiology. And so, yeah, I don't think doing similar studies is a major problem, or replicating what's been done before.
Yeah, definitely. I guess the only thing I would add to that is I've heard it spoken before about, actually, are meta-analyses that good because only the positive results tend to get
Yeah.
published, and then you get a sort of systematic bias of all those papers that found strength training didn't improve durability. They didn't make it into the journal, and so actually you only get
Absolutely.
released with the good ones. And then yeah, I think actually that's probably overplayed in general, but it's just
Yeah,
that, isn't it?
and it is a shame if that happens, for sure. But yeah, it probably does happen to some extent. I think when you spend, particularly these types of studies, like, yeah, you guys have been involved with them and have been carrying them out yourselves, and it's like they're incredibly time consuming. They're really hard to recruit, and they're just so demanding for the participants that I think even if you get a kind of null finding, like, you'd still want to get it published just for the sake of yourself and the participants a lot of the time.
Yeah,
Definitely.
I think
Definitely.
am I right?
One last
saying
thing
as
on
well?
that paper, which I spent 5 minutes just finding it now because I've read it before. But one of the things I found interesting was when you look at the two groups of the ones that have done the strength training and not done the strength training and put through the durability protocol, economy is actually identical at the start, isn't it? There's only a difference emerges at 90-minute and 75-minute time point, which is funny because I classically I'd have thought running economy would just be improved from time zero. If we're trying to improve,
Yeah, that was that did surprise us, and we still don't have an explanation for why we didn't see a change in running economy in an unfatigued state. Like, I speculated whether the speed was probably a bit too slow. Again, it's something that you can relate to, and other well-trained runners, that we had them running at 10 and 12 kilometers an hour. And I think, if they never even do their easy running, I mean, 12 kilometers an hour is like 5 minutes a kilometer, or 8-minute miling roughly. And so, yeah, for well-trained marathon runners, like, they might not even go that slow in a warm-up perhaps. And so if it feels a little bit sort of artificial to be running at 10 and 12, and you're trying to detect quite small changes, like, maybe it was just a little bit too slow. But yeah, it was still a surprising result that we didn't see the change until they're actually a bit tired.
Yeah, I guess fatigue is going to magnify any response you're going to see, isn't it? You'd expect anyway. So I'm sure there probably are differences at those earlier stages, just harder to detect.
Yeah, exactly. And I think a bit more anecdotally, and maybe something that you guys can relate to, is like, generally over the years of working with runners, that when you sort of put them through a training intervention of strength work, like, they kind of come back and sort of anecdotally say, like, I just kind of feel a bit stronger, Rich, like, particularly in the latter stages of training sessions and races. And I think this sort of this kind of data we've produced now would certainly support that kind of sensation that a lot of runners feel after they've done a strength training intervention.
Yeah, definitely. I think one last question, if you still got time, Rich, we don't want to keep you up too late. Is what different approaches, and I guess what things are you trying to target in an S&C program in a middle distance athlete versus a marathon runner? And I guess let's take an extreme, like an 800-meter runner who's borderline a sprinter versus a marathon runner. Are there different qualities you're trying to develop and different emphasis you're going for in the training?
To an extent. I think, again, if with an 800-meter runner that's not engaged much with S&C before versus the marathon runner that's fairly new to it, like, my approach wouldn't be too different. Like, there'd be quite a lot of overlap. I think once runners are a bit more accustomed to it, like, I would generally be expecting an 800-meter runner to perhaps do a bit more volume, either in terms of how much they do in sessions, or like how many sessions they do across the week. So maybe like 2.5 to 3 sessions a week, whereas a marathon runner might get away with just a couple of shorter ones. I guess what we sort of know about running biomechanics and trying to get changes in running speed, that up to about 24 kilometers an hour, which is it's about 4-minute miling. So it's really quick. Like most of it comes through the soleus. Like the soleus is a sort of major energy contributor towards the energy that's delivered to the body up to that sort of speed. Whereas over 24 kilometers an hour, which for most 800-meter runners is the sort of speeds they're going to be hitting. Like muscles around the hips, so particularly the glutes and the hip flexors, become much more dominant and important. And so the types of exercises that I would typically pick, it would be a little bit more hip focused for a middle distance runner. But for the marathon runner, like they've got to be doing stuff around calf and Achilles as more of a priority. And I think that then extends into the injury prevention stuff that sort of this time of year and sort of pre-season track, when they're starting to get in spikes and starting to do some faster repetitions close to race pace. Like you're obviously going to want the hamstrings well prepared for that, the hip flexors pretty well prepared for that. Whereas those are kind of muscles that for the marathon runner probably aren't going to be stressed quite as much. So again, I'd probably be aiming to target more sort of foot and ankle structures with the marathon runner a little bit more than the middle distance runner, perhaps. And I think lastly, the sort of mechanisms of improvement are a bit different. And you kind of alluded to this at the start, that for the marathon runner, like we know that running economy is probably out of the 3 determinants, like the most important thing to be focusing on and developing. And it's still important for a middle distance runner for sure, but we know that maximal sprint speed is absolutely key. We know that sort of anaerobic capacity and similar sort of qualities are really important for the middle distance runner. And so you're probably going to get improvements in those things that have an effect on performance with the middle distance runner compared to economy.
That was going to be my follow-up. What is the strength of relationship between sort of like physical components you can measure in a gym and like maximal sprint speed? Is there a good, can you have a good effect on sprint speed by squatting, CMJs, all that sort of stuff? I mean, I from the work I've done, when I've been dragged into doing force plate data, there's been quite a good correlation between like a CMJ and maximal sprint speed.
There's very good correlations. A lot of that evidence comes from games players, and so there's some studies that have shown that if we get an athlete a bit more explosive in the weights room, that will carry through to top speed sprinting like quite well. I think there's 5 studies in endurance runners, including one that I did with a group of post-pubertal adolescent distance runners, and it's not a great sample size, but there tends to be a small benefit to maximal sprint speed by engaging with like heavy resistance training and stuff. So it's not convincing, but there seems to be a small effect on maximal sprint speeds for sure. So I think most middle distance runners, they need to be sprinting alongside it. If they just expect to get faster just by squatting, it's probably not going to always work. It's quite as simply as that.
Yeah.
I think
closing
maybe,
remarks there, Owain?
Yeah, just the last question I had really was just sort of any sort of common mistakes you see people making. Maybe when they're starting out S&C or they've been at it a while. Is there anything that still sticks in your mind and you feel like you're saying it a lot?
I think we've touched upon it already, but sort of either end of the scale, either dabbling with it and not really doing it properly. And so, okay, I went to the gym last week, but I've not been for a couple of weeks now. And then you expect it to have a beneficial effect. So just sort of lack of consistency over a long period of time. And then I think at the other end of that scale, like you see a lot on sort of social media forums and stuff saying, oh, I'm so sore from my S&C, or it's really, really affecting my running sessions and so on. And then you sort of see their program, and it's like they're doing so much volume. It looks like almost like a bodybuilder type routine. And so they've not sort of hit that kind of sweet spot middle ground of okay, you just need to do a bit and do it properly, but not do 20 to 30 sets of lower limb work in a session. And so, yeah, you're obviously going to be sore and fatigued for key running sessions in a week if you're doing that type of volume. And so I think, yeah, doing a small amount consistently over a long period of time is usually going to be the mistake that people, don't do.
Cool. Yeah, that was it for me. Anything else, Dan?
I was just going to finish with, what does your S&C program currently look like, Rich? Because you're a runner yourself. How much are you managing to incorporate into your busy life?
Yeah, I still do a couple of sessions a week. I think like over time, and this is something we've discussed already, that like I think once you sort of experience with S&C, and like runners obviously know their own bodies quite well, and they can chat to their coach and hopefully an S&C coach about it. You get to a point that you kind of figure out the right combination of exercises that work well for you. And for me at the moment, it's just about staying healthy and injury free. And so I know if I drop certain exercises out of my program, like probably not straight away, but maybe like in a month's time, I'm running a risk of developing an injury. And so like I'll always keep those sorts of exercises in. And equally, there's certain exercises I've done in the past where it just kind of leaves me just like a bit too tight in certain areas. And I'm not even talking about excessive volumes here. I'm just talking about low volumes. Like it always feels like quite a shock to the system when I start doing it again. And so I'm always a bit careful about introducing certain exercises. And I've got to do it on a week that I'm maybe not doing a lot of running, or I can sort of take the risk or the gamble. But you almost stick to the recipe that sort of works for you rather than trying anything that's too risky.
Definitely, as a non-S&C coach, completely the opposite of that. It definitely seems like a lot of art to getting it right, and obviously a big knowledge base behind that. But you're still tinkering with things. Is my impression.
Yeah, definitely, and without talking about age too much as well, because it's something we haven't spoken about at all on this podcast. Like the other thing with master age runners, sort of runners over about 35 years old, is that we know that you obviously get degeneration to tendons and you get atrophy to muscles, particularly if you're not engaging with higher intensity strength training. So running by itself generally won't maintain those tissues. And so I think strength training just for health and longevity, and then for running, just keeping you healthy and running, becomes really important. More so than just sort of like a normal adult runner.
I mean,
we need to do a whole episode, don't we, on the masters athlete? It's something we've not spent enough time on, probably because of our own biases of not quite been in that bracket yet. But we'll address that. Don't worry.
Good to hear.
So thanks very much for your time, Rich. Really, really great to get you on, and I'm sure it's going to be a really popular episode. So thanks very much.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks a lot for the invitation, both. I really appreciate it.